see y'all aren't front row people. I'm up here by myself. I have been apportioned the profane task of speaking to you all today about politics. All of you have political opinions in this room. I also want to assure you that I too have political opinions. Not only that, I assure you that my political opinions are better than your political opinions. If you'd like to hear about how much more just and self-righteous and correct I am than all of you, I find it takes about 2 to 3 bourbons to enjoy the conversation, and I don't time my drinking, so come find me afterwards. But the reason that people listen to me talk is not for my political opinions, it's because I try and give them an objective and unvarnished view of what I think is going on in the world. If I do my job correctly, you will have no idea who I voted for in the last presidential election. Also, if I do my job correctly, you will not agree with everything that I say up here. If you find that you agreed with 100% of what I said, I have failed you. My job is to try and make you think differently about the world. So for the next roughly 40, 50 minutes or so, I'd ask that you put aside your preconceptions, your views about how you think the world should be, and let's engage in a conversation about how the world actually is and what we can learn from that conversation going forward. With that out of the way, you may think that somebody who's going to talk about geopolitics is going to start with US-China trade or the Trump administration or the Russia-Ukraine war or any of the myriad ways in which the media wants to convince us that our world is falling apart. But I want to start in a little bit of a different place. I want to give us some perspective. I don't think what we're going through right now is cyclical. I think it's structural. And I think we are seeing a change in American agriculture that we haven't seen in literally a century. And I want to take you back to the 1920s. This was a map that was developed by the Department of Agriculture at the time. You may know the Secretary of Agriculture during the 1920s was a man named Herbert Hoover. He would come on, he would later become President of the United States. And Herbert Hoover was dealing with a massive crisis in US agriculture. One of the things that got invented in World War I, it wasn't just munitions and weapons and all sorts of fancy things to kill each other. We also got the advent of modern fertilizers as a result. And in both the United States and really around the world, you had massive surges in agricultural yields that farmers didn't even think were possible. And it was ironic. They suddenly were so good at the job that they were supposed to be doing that the prices for all the things that they were growing were collapsing. And US farmers were literally burning crops in the field because they couldn't get a high enough price for the things that they were growing. So Herbert Hoover said, I'm going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'm going to save the American farmer by exporting all of our surplus calories to Europe, whose farm system had been decimated by the destruction of World War I. And number 2, by doing so, by making sure that the Europeans are well fed, we will nip in the bud the rise of these scary ideologies that we see on the horizon, like communism and fascism. One of those 2 things didn't work. Communism and fascism came anyway. But on the first, Hoover was incredibly successful. And it has sustained American agriculture to think about exporting our surplus calories abroad literally for the last 100 years. And I would submit to you that that is beginning to change. Now, if you look at the world right now, today, the world of globalization that we know, most of the world cannot feed itself. In this map that I'm showing you, the countries in dark are countries that can feed themselves or have surplus. The lighter you are on this map, the less self-sufficient you can be in terms of your calories. Depending on the crop type that we're talking about, roughly between 11 to 28% of the world can feed itself, the crops that they eat, on a daily basis. That's how globalization works, by the way. It's supposed to work that way. Those of us that have more, we make profit by sending to these places around the world that don't necessarily have that. And that is today how the global food system works. It does not have to work that way, though. It's been working that way for 100 years because it's easier and because the countries in dark can produce crops relatively cheap compared to those countries in light, but those countries that are in light can produce crops of their own if they want to. This is a map from National Geographic, and by the way, my slides will be available afterwards. I don't feel like you have to memorize it or take pictures or anything. The darker shades here, the red, the orange, the bright orange that is popping on the map, those are areas that have relatively low crop yield to what they could if they had a modicum of modern seed technology, modern machinery, modern farming practices. Large parts of, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia are still farming like it's the 1950s and the 1960s. My favorite example to drive this home is Ethiopia. In 2018, Ethiopia came out and said, we want to be a net wheat exporter. We don't want to import wheat anymore. We're going to be self-sufficient in wheat, and we're going to export it to the rest of East Africa. I laughed at them. I made them the butt of joke in my slides. I said there was no possible way Ethiopia could do this. Just no way. It took them all of 3 years to make me look like an idiot. By 2021, they were exporting wheat to the rest of East Africa, and they did it despite the pandemic, and despite the fact that they fought a civil war in their own country that killed hundreds of thousands of people. How did they do it? The government literally went out and bought better seeds and better machines and better fertilizer and went to the farms and said, this is how you need to do it, and their yields skyrocketed, and they started trading more and more with East Africa, which is a market that U.S. wheat exporters would love to get into. That was not an exception. That's a canary in the coal mine. And if you look around the world, you've got countries thinking about food self-sufficiency, about not being dependent on importing food anymore for national security reasons. That is a paradigmatic change. We have not been through this sort of change in 100 years, and it's just something I really want to drive here going forward. A few more things to drive that into the coffin. This is from USDA. This is showing you exports versus imports in terms of U.S. food. We now import more food than we export. That started in 2016, and USDA projections are that we're only going to import more and more over time. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I just want you to understand, we import more food than we export, the most fertile, agriculturally powerful country in the world. That's not a cyclical change, that's a structural change. Hug a corn farmer if you know them. Brazil has come and they've taken our lunch money, basically. The same is true of soybeans. Brazil is the low-cost producer for these things going forward. There's our U.S. soybean sales to China. I'm going to get to China a little bit later in the presentation. I've been talking for years now about how the U.S. ag community, the U.S. tech community, the U.S. manufacturing community, if you can make money off of China, great, but it should be considered bonus. Anybody who is betting the future on China is betting on a country that does not want to do business with us and that can flip a switch and not do business with us if they want, and they have alternatives out there. It's also not just a row crop story. Just look at our beef exports by volume this year compared to last year. We're down almost 47% in China. Our friends in Australia are running to the bank very happy with that. We're down 9% overall in general. So something is happening structurally in the agricultural markets in the world, and for the first time in 100 years, we're not in the catbird seat. We're not the low-cost producer. We're not the one calling the shots. Okay, that's the negative thing to start off with. Now I want to get into the bulk of the presentation. We get so much out there about uncertainty and risk. If I hear the word uncertainty one more time this year at a conference, I'm going to light what is left of my hair on fire. There is so much uncertainty out there. Risks are rising, tensions escalating. What does any of that mean? So instead, I want to lean in and I want to tell you 6 things that I am relatively certain about. And if you want to know the percentage certain, you'll have to find me afterwards with the bourbon. But instead of giving you uncertainty, I want to give you certainty. Also, I'm going to be talking about change. And as human beings, we don't like change. We like routines. We like things to stay the way that they are. So I'm not going to be giving you a picture of the world that is profoundly optimistic, but I am going to give you a picture of the world that I think is changing. And as somebody who deploys capital and thinks about this on a daily basis, I like change. That means disruption, and that means opportunity. So I don't want you to take from this presentation that you should run into a fetal position and bemoan the fact that all these changes are happening. I hope that identifying these points of change will actually give you places for how to think about that opportunity in a world that is changing around us. Okay, so the first thing that I am certain about is that the world is multipolar. Multipolar is just a pretentious, highfalutin word to say that there is not one global dominant power in the world today. I do not care how old you are. I do not care how much experience you have. None of us in this room have lived in a truly multipolar geopolitical environment. For the last 30 or 40 years, the United States, the buck literally stopped with us. We're the most powerful country in the world, economically, politically, culturally, militarily. You name it, we were the top dog. For the 40, 50 years before that, we were in a Cold War, a bipolar conflict. Just not to say the world was crazy, it's always a little bit crazy, but we had the Soviet Union on one side, we had the United States on the other side. You have to go back to the 1890s to get the first truly multipolar world order that we experienced. So again, if you were around in the 1890s, please come find me. I'd like to know how you've made it this long. Hopefully you're not a vampire. But we have not lived through this sort of geopolitical environment for quite some time. Here's one of the silver linings, though. This is how the world usually works. When you look back at the history of human civilization, unipolar moments, where one country or one empire is the most powerful entity in the world, are extremely rare. The list is the United States for the past 40 years, the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, and that's the list. That's everybody. You might be thinking, what about the Romans? The Chinese would have something to say about it. You look back at the history of human civilization, it's more about rising and falling powers all across the world competing with each other. And that's what we're going back to. This map is a thought experiment of mine. It's not going to get everything correct, but instead of looking at the world as an undifferentiated global market where we just send good product out into and it gets bought, I want you to think of the world in terms of those rival spheres of political, economic, and trade influence. You can see I've got the United States here in dark blue. I've got the Europeans in that ugly shade of teal. The Chinese are there in orange. The red around Turkey usually makes people sit up in their chairs. I'll have you know Turkey's building military bases in every single one of those countries that I've shaded. Brazil has a little mini empire developing in South America. I cannot decide if India is going to collapse in on itself or take over the subcontinent, so I've just punted and I've thrown them into a category of middle powers. I update this once a quarter. It doesn't matter if I get the shadings right. What I want you to understand is at the top level, the world is deglobalizing. But within these spheres, we're actually getting more integration. So even if at a global level we're moving away from globalization, if you're in that right sphere of influence, you might actually have more globalization. So we have to keep two contradictory ideas in our mind at the same time without going crazy. Now that's a little bit abstract, so let me put a little bit of meat on the bone. I love this chart. What is that? That's your left? That's your left. I love this chart on the left. It's showing you the value of the US dollar based on time zones when they get traded around the world. You can see in North America, the dollar is roughly flat on the year. We haven't gone up, we haven't gone down that much. The Europeans, when they're awake and when they're trading the US dollar, they're down between 6 and 7%. And Asian markets, when they're awake and trading the US dollar, they're down about 10%. I cannot make multipolarity any clearer to you than that, although maybe I can. That chart on the right is showing you the performance of a couple of different asset classes this year so far. Your best financial decision in January would have been to put everything you have into gold and Bitcoin, rather than the S&P 500, rather than US Treasuries, rather than any US dollar-denominated asset. So when I say that the world is multipolar, when I say that countries don't trust the United States anymore, when I say that countries are actively competing with us, I mean it. You can see in their time zones when they're selling us and what they're doing, and you can see it in how asset classes are performing. I think that when historians look back at 2025, the first thing they write about will not be Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. It will not be about any of the myriad problems that we're all facing on a daily basis. I think it will be about the break in relations between the United States and Europe, because this, again, is something that we haven't seen since the 1940s. And it all happened relatively quickly in the span of a week. It began with Pete Hegseth going to our NATO allies and lecturing them about not spending enough on their military. Now, Barack Obama did that, so if it had stopped there, that wouldn't have been that big of a deal. But a couple days later, President Trump called Vladimir Putin, didn't give anybody a heads up, just decided to call Vladimir and said, hey, I want to end this war in Ukraine. What kind of deal can we make? European allies not happy about that. And then the very next day, Vice President Vance went to the Munich Security Conference, where a bunch of European security officials gather each year to talk about the future. And he told them their biggest threat was not China and not Russia and not any of the things that they were worried about, but rather European censorship laws. And that if Europe really wanted US support going forward, they better be nicer to the US and buy more things from the United States. The response from European countries was, we cannot trust the United States anymore. The Germans said, you want us to spend more of our GDP on the military? Okay, we'll spend more of our money on the military. As somebody whose family fled Europe the last time Germany spent this much on the military, I wish somebody would read some history. Germany also said we can't trust the United States anymore. It's a general trope, and it's not just Europe. This is Gustavo Petro. He's the president of Colombia. You might remember it's so long ago, February now, where President Trump was lecturing Colombia about taking some of our illegal migrants into their country, and Petro said no, and President Trump said, well, then we've got 50% tariffs for you, and higher tariffs if you don't listen to us. And President Petro backed down. He couldn't afford to upset the United States. But it's not a coincidence that 2 or 3 months later, he was in China signing Colombia up for the Belt and Road Initiative. We could talk about Japan. Prime Minister Ishiba actually just lost his position, but this is him lecturing Japan's Diet about how its relations with the US on a trade basis had become a national security issue, and that Japan needed to figure out how to push back against the United States going forward. Brazil is one of the only countries in the world, major countries in the world, with which we don't have a trade deficit, we have a trade surplus. We decided to tariff them as well, and you can see the impacts of that in your coffee prices as they continue to climb sky high. We decided to arrest a bunch of South Korean workers in my home state of Georgia because we thought they were here illegally, which they weren't here illegally, but now they've suspended all investment into manufacturing and construction inside our country, which is the exact opposite of what we wanted going forward. And here, of course, is Russia and India and China all shaking hands together. So I'm beating a dead horse. The world is multipolar. We're no longer calling the shots. There are all these competitive things happening around the world. If you want to understand why there is so much bumpiness, so much turbulence in U.S. foreign policy right now, it's because we are behaving like we are still the top dog while the world has changed around us. This picture here of this gentleman, raise your hand if you know who that is. Don't feel bad, most audiences don't. That is William McKinley, President of the United States from 1898 to 1900. If I'd put his Vice President, Teddy Roosevelt, up, you probably would have recognized him. Teddy took over for McKinley when McKinley was assassinated in office in 1900. Donald Trump cannot stop talking about William McKinley. He loves William McKinley, and there's a reason for the affinity. William McKinley self-described himself as a quote-unquote tariff man. He loved tariffs. He enacted tariffs on all different sorts of countries all around the world. He was also president when the United States won the Spanish-American War and basically took control from the Philippines all the way to Puerto Rico. You can see in some of these liberal journals here of literally the bald eagle extending its wings all around the world after victory in the Spanish-American War. Now, tariffs in 1898 worked really, really well. And they worked really, really well for the United States economy because at that time, we had the biggest share of global manufacturing output in the world, almost 25%. The British Empire was right behind us. They were the ones that we were usurping, and then you had the rest of the world after the fact. We will come back to that pie chart in a second. But if you want to understand this turbulence in U.S. foreign policy and trade policy, it's that we're behaving like we're the top dog in the room, and I think we're not the top dog in the room anymore. I think we're in a multipolar world, and if we're going to have countries align with us, we have to make it a little bit sweeter for them. Okay, what's the second thing that I'm certain about? U.S. electricity prices are going to go up, and we need every single electron. What do I mean when I say they're going to go up? I'm expecting 20% year-on-year increases for the next 3 to 4 years. This is, again, something that we have not had to face that much of for really 4 or 5 decades. If you look at trends in U.S. electricity consumption over the past 4 to 5 decades, they've been relatively flat. We've been consuming a flat amount of electricity. You'll also notice, though, on this chart that something was happening in the 1950s and 60s, where our electricity consumption growth was to the moon. So what was happening in the 50s and 60s? We had new things like refrigerators and freezers and air conditioning, things that we could not imagine our lives without today, and they all needed a massive amount of electricity. We also needed all of this power at the very same time that oil production in the United States was starting to flag. And that begins our obsession with the Middle East, with energy security, with all of these things that really defined U.S. geopolitics until the shale revolution in 2008. Now, when you get into the 1990s and 2000, one of the most amazing things about the internet and the cell phones that we all use, those tech innovations, is that they really weren't consuming that much more power. Our electricity growth consumption was flat. That's beginning to change because AI, data centers, robotics, automation, they consume a lot of electricity. And our grid is not prepared for the growth in electricity consumption growth that is happening. This is showing you change in residential electricity prices from May 24 to May 25. The ones that are in purple that see some decreases, that's honestly because the data is old. North Dakota actually just announced that they were up 20% last year as well. So somewhere between 10 and 20% just over the past year, and I'm telling you, I think that's the way it's going to be for the next 3 to 4 years because of some of these increases in power consumption going forward. If you don't believe me, take it from the U.S. Energy Administration. They have residential electricity prices up annually 13 to 18% over the next couple of years. One of the interesting things, though, on this chart that I want to point to is that even as electricity prices are going up, natural gas prices are either flat or going down. Gasoline is projected to be down. Heating oil is projected to be going down. This is not necessarily an energy problem. We actually have more energy than we know what to do with. This is a grid problem. We don't know how to get energy from point A to point B. Now that sounds scary, but I would submit to you that it is also an opportunity. There is a reason that the Microsofts and all the big companies with all the dollars are thinking about, well, how do I store energy? Do I build solar panels? Do I buy abandoned coal mines and turn them into small nuclear reactors? How do I get myself, first of all, off the grid and then store energy such that I might be able to sell back into the grid for profit? Right now, we have all these stranded energy assets that are just sitting out there, and American farmers are sitting on some of them themselves, whether it's a herd of cattle, whether it's fields that the sun is shining on. There's going to be a huge market, I think, for some of this stranded electricity and power. This is from a Department of Energy report that the Trump administration released just a couple of weeks ago. I don't put much text in my slides, but I put this in because I think it really drives home just how serious this is. It's impossible for the nation's bulk power system to meet AI growth requirements while maintaining a reliable power grid. With projected load growth, we're risking power outages by 100 times more in 2030. Our modeling shows annual outage hours could increase from single digits today than more than 800 hours per year. Imagine in your home or your business that you're going from blackouts a couple hours over the course of the year to hundreds of hours every single year. That's what the US government is telling us is coming in general. So electricity prices are going to increase, and I'm going to skip this section to go in here. All right, the third thing that I am certain about: civilizations forget things, and this is where we're going to roll up our sleeves and get into China a little bit. If you are having trouble sleeping, aside from listening to my podcast, may I submit to you this book, The Construction of Gothic Cathedrals by John Fitchen. I like it because I'm a nerd, but it might help you go to sleep at night. John Fitchen is dealing with a very interesting problem. He's an architectural historian, and architectural historians cannot figure out how Europeans built Gothic cathedrals in the 12 and 1300s with the technology that was available to them. We have all sorts of incredible things that would absolutely astound people from that time period. This microphone, these slides, everything in this room would be absolutely astounding to them, but we don't know how to do with rock and stone and glass what they did in the 12 and 1300s. That knowledge is lost to us. Another example of this that I could have put up here is the pyramids. There are legitimate intellectuals and historians who think that the pyramids must have been created by aliens because it does not make sense. How else could they have been built based on the technology at the time? Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because the United States has forgotten to make things. We don't know how to make things in this country anymore. Remember that pie graph with William McKinley when we were making 25 to 30% of the things that were manufactured in the world every single day? That's China now. And we're in the position that the British were in when we were the up-and-coming upstart. China today accounts for 35% of the gross production of manufacturing in the world. If you come back to me and say, okay, Jacob, sure, they probably make the furniture and the umbrellas and the non-innovative things, but this is an authoritarian economy. There's no way they're doing the truly innovative stuff. Okay, let's do value added then. It's still 29%, and it's still the rest of the world at 31%. A majority of the world is making things in the world, and we are not making things in the world in general. This is a point of massive asymmetric leverage for China, because as much as we want to have a trade war with China, as much as we want to force China to do things, whether that's buy our soybeans or leave Taiwan alone or any other of the myriad things we've asked them to do, China can look at us and say, well, we make most of the things that are critical for the global economy to work. Let me bang that home a little bit. In 2000, all the countries in blue here on this map on your left, those were countries whose largest trading partner was the United States of America. In 2024, all the countries in red are countries whose largest trading partner is China. This happened over the last 25 years. Even into the 2000s, most countries were trading more with us than China. Now most of them are trading with China. It's one of the reasons when we ask countries to not engage with China, they say, we don't think we can do that. Look at the top employer in each state in the Union in 1990. Look how much blue manufacturing there is on that map on the left. Compare it to last year, where the top employer in each state in 2024, we've still got a couple manufacturing stalwarts. Wisconsin is still there where the top employer is manufacturing. But by and large, healthcare was our biggest employer in 2024, not manufacturing. We're not a manufacturing economy anymore. The United States Navy is the source of our military power in the world. The United States Navy is the strongest, most impressive, most technologically advanced naval force the planet has ever seen. There has never been anything like the United States Navy. And despite the fact that we have these 250 incredibly advanced ships, if the Chinese or aliens or somebody else wanted to blow them up, we don't know how to build any more of them particularly quickly. We account for less than 1% of shipbuilding on an annual basis in the world each day. You might have missed, just yesterday, the Chinese announced a bunch of sanctions on South Korean shipbuilders that have been building ships for US companies because the Chinese are responding to some of these trade import restrictions that we've put on them in general. Critical minerals, rare earths, have been in the news lately. Rare earths are really poorly named. They are not rare. You can find them anyway. They're just incredibly costly and pollutive to mine and refine. And the Chinese don't care about that. They'll do it. We have all sorts of regulations. And so the point is, We import lots of critical minerals that are really important for manufacturing from China and from countries like Russia, Brazil, and even Canada. I have a client that I work with who is trying to run a startup that is going to refine at least some of these minerals in the United States. And I was talking to him a couple weeks ago and I said, let's say I gave you a magic wand, you get as many tax breaks, bureaucratic red tape gotten rid of in the United States. How long would it take you to spin up capacity to meet our needs versus what we're importing from China right now? And he said, Jacob, if you gave me that magic wand, I think 5 to 7 years. We're in a trade conflict with the Chinese right now. We don't have 5 to 7 years to go develop and refine our own rare earth elements and minerals when we need them right now. Solar, that's roughly 79% to 99% China, based on what part of the supply chain you're talking about. The little switches and radios that go in the telecom towers that allowed me to send stupid cat videos to my wife and daughters last night when I was in the hotel room, we make a grand total of 0% of those things in the United States. Even though the first Trump administration in 2017 tried to say we should make more of these things in the United States. All of that equipment comes from China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. That's the list. This is one that really galls me. The active pharmaceutical ingredients in many of our medications, the ibuprofen that I give my daughter when she has an ear infection, the active ingredient in that is probably coming from China or India, because more than 50% of our pharmaceutical imports were coming from China or India. You want to go further up the value scale, the Invisalign that straightened my teeth so that I don't look like an ogre, that came from Mexico. The contact lenses that I'm wearing right now so that I can all see you and see my slides, those were manufactured in Ireland. A lot of the advanced cancer treatments that are out there right now, those are coming from Germany. So even on a healthcare basis, even though healthcare is our top employer, we're not making these things in the United States. Amino acids, it's basically China and Europe. We're a very small part of the game. Vitamins, even more so, China and Europe. We're a very small part of the game. Here's one where my money is where my mouth is. I'm actually investing in a facility in Minnesota right now that's trying to bring back some of the manufacture of fertilizer to the United States. We could get it cheaper from China and Russia, and we did, but we have plenty of energy here. Why aren't we making fertilizer in the United States going forward? Agricultural machinery, as we continue to have spats with the Canadians, well, we get a lot of our agricultural machinery from Canada going forward. So, we don't make things in the United States anymore, and China has us over the barrel. Or do they? I think we're going to see a short-term trade deal with China. It wouldn't surprise me if it happens in the next 6 weeks. President Trump is still going to meet Xi Jinping on the sidelines of a conference in South Korea in early November. And the reason is, although China does make a lot of things, they also have a very big problem. China's communist only in name. This is not a particularly equal society. And the biggest problem that China has right now, it's not Taiwan and it's not trade, it's that you've got places on the coast of China that have cities that make our cities look pedestrian by comparison, versus hundreds of millions of people who are living in the interior of China on something like less than $5 to $7 a day. Hundreds of millions of people living like peasants on the one hand versus these coastal elites who are living an incredibly advanced and sophisticated life. And what Xi Jinping has to do, without getting his head chopped off, is he has to take the wealth from the coast and redistribute it to the interior. And he has to do it fast enough that the peasants don't rise up and chop his head off. And he has to do it in such a way that the wealthy folks on the coast who have enjoyed such success don't rise up and chop his head off. It's a thankless job and one that I wouldn't want for myself. And it's why China will be willing to make a short-term deal, because they don't want to deal with the disruption that's going to happen in their economy as a result of trade. That said, I just want to remind you what happened the last time a Trump administration made a deal with China. China promised to buy a lot of U.S. agricultural products. They bought 58% of what they committed to. They bought what they needed, and what they didn't need, or what they could get from other places, like Brazil, like Argentina, anywhere else, they absolutely did. So I think the headlines on China will probably turn much more positive here, if not in the next few weeks, probably in the next few months, and I think you should ignore it. It's fool's gold. If we can make money off of China, great, it's bonus. I've been saying this for years and people haven't been listening to me, so I'm going to make it even more stark. If you are a CEO, if you are somebody who has control over a business and you are betting on China as your future market that's going to carry you to growth, it's malpractice at this point. That market is probably not going to be there in 5 to 10 years. So make money off of it if you can, but start contingency planning because they need us a lot less than we need them going forward. We have a labor problem. I'm doing okay on time. We have a labor problem / we have a labor opportunity. If you look at construction wages or manufacturing wages versus inflation, wages overall, going back to 2017, have been running hotter than inflation. So yes, like the price of products and food and other things have gone up, the price of labor has gone up even more. If you look at US manufacturing job openings going back to 2010, this is a trend that is fairly long in the tooth right now, the trend line is up. And the reason is not that we're not trying to manufacture more in the United States. We really are trying to fix this thing, but a generation of American workers don't have the skills they need to do those jobs. Like I said, we forgot how to make things. So even though we have all these manufacturing job openings in the United States, they're not being filled, and they're not being filled at a higher and higher percentage. And that's telling you that there's a mismatch in the workforce between the workers that we do have and the jobs that are open going forward. If you look at farm workers and how that impacts farm workers, there's two things to point out here. On a nominal basis, farm worker wages are also rising significantly over inflation. But when you adjust for inflation, it's actually not such a pretty story. So even though farm workers are maybe making higher value dollar amounts in terms of nominal wages, their real wages have not kept pace with inflation. And what that probably tells you is those workers are either going to find other jobs or they're going to have to be paid a lot more than they're being paid now, even though those nominal wages are relatively high. To add insult to injury, our demographic picture in this country has not been particularly good over the past 20 to 25 years. We're not having nearly as many babies as we were having before. And the pandemic really took an axe to that. People stopped having babies because they were afraid. Now, for the record, I did my part. We've had 2 daughters since the pandemic, so don't blame me for this problem. But you could see most Americans were not so optimistic. And I understand. COVID was scary. We didn't know what it was going to do at the time. Our saving grace to our demographic picture during this time period was immigration. And immigration causes other problems because, oh, they're stealing our jobs, oh, the border is not secure, everything else. We can talk about that over bourbon. I'm just talking about what the statistics tell us. Demographically, we're not having as many babies as we used to, and we picked up the slack and didn't feel the slack as much because we were getting lots of migrants who wanted to come to the United States for a better life. They didn't want to go to China, by the way. They didn't want to go to Turkey. They didn't want to go anywhere. They wanted to come to the United States to have a better life in general. And that meant that labor inflation and the prices of some of these things was relatively in check. This is from the US Department of Homeland Security. That red line, that flat lines in February, that's border encounters at the Mexican border so far this year. It's basically close to zero. Those are record low numbers of migration coming in to the border. The Trump administration is bragging about this right now. And I would submit to you that hopefully at some point we can have a conversation about how we need a secure border, but we also need a way to figure out how to get migrants into the country securely with the skills that we need to power the economy. Because if we have the border overrun and there's no security, we have a problem. And if we have the border at zero, we have a different sort of problem. So for the last couple of years, we had the former. Right now, we're just beginning to feel the effects of the latter, and you should expect to see that in rising prices in terms of labor, especially in the farm economy going forward. I'll skip this and just say that I think there is an opportunity hiding here in plain sight in robotics and automation. When you look at the United States in terms of its installation of industrial robots per capita, so per the number of workers that we have, we are somewhere on this list between Slovenia and Taiwan. So not covering ourselves in glory, particularly there, when it comes to the forefront of manufacturing. You can see Korea, Singapore, Germany, Japan, China are there at the top. China actually installs one out of every 2 industrial robots that is installed in the world today. Chinese manufacturing workers, by the way, are also losing their jobs, not to the Vietnamese, not to Indians, but to robots, because the Chinese are automating their economy at an incredibly rapid pace. If you also look at actual adoption rate versus what was expected, so people had all these projections about how the United States was going to be at the forefront of robotics. Here again, we're somewhere between Spain and Austria in terms of our actual implementation of what people projected with robots. China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, those ones are at the top. So that tells us that robotics is not going to pick up much of the slack going forward, but I also would tell you that those that can be at the front of this, especially with some of those demographic issues that we're talking about and those price increases that we're talking about for labor, there's going to be some opportunity there in the labor market too. The fifth thing that I am certain about is that Americans are sick of their politicians, and also that there is no time like the present to deploy capital and to think about the future. If you look at Gallup polling over the past 30 years, you'll see that for a long time, it would change a little bit, but Americans were relatively equal, independents, Democrats, and Republicans. And ever since 2008, you've got a large silent majority, Nixon's silent majority, doing just fine and well, and almost 42% of voters saying they don't identify with either of these parties. And in a truly poetic act of statistical inference, you've got the same number of people identifying as Democrats and Republicans for the last 2 years running in Gallup polling data. What this is telling you is that the extremes have captured the conversation in the two major political parties, and that there is a silent 42% of the electorate that is sitting there waiting for good policy. And the reason I'm bringing this up, again, we need bourbon to decide which one of these lines is correct and which one we should support. You should expect whipsaws in U.S. policy, because as the extremes trade hands, they're not trading off in any meaningful way. We're going from one set of policies to another while the middle sits it out. If you look at President Biden's approval ratings, let's say on the economy when he left office, they were at 37%. President Trump's are down to about 44%. So he's really not doing that much better than Joe Biden was in general. I think the honeymoon period for him is probably going to start wearing off a little bit soon. If you are a fiscal conservative, there is only one president in the last 70 years who should garner your admiration. His name is William Jefferson Clinton. Besides from Bill Clinton, there is no U.S. president who has done anything about the U.S. budget deficit. And President Trump was maybe the worst offender when it looks at this. Biden was fairly bad too. I just don't have him on this chart right this second. So you should expect the budget deficit to continue to be blowed out and for these extremes to basically try and buy more of a lease on power by giving goodies and bread and circuses to the electorate. If you look at the one big beautiful bill, President Trump was very smart about this. All of the cuts that are supposed to be fiscally conservative will not come into place until after the midterms and probably not until after the next presidential election. You show me a president who's going to follow through on the cuts that President Trump has promised right now, I will show you a chipmunk that speaks Swahili. It does not exist. No president is going to cut prices is going to cut spending because Donald Trump said he was going to. By the way, what have we increased spending on? Well, we've just given ICE a budget relatively equivalent to the military of Italy. We've also slashed a bunch of money when it comes to rural health care. So there's no fiscal conservatism that is coming. And the reason I say now is the time to do things is because when you look at inflation expectations, they're literally almost off the charts. The U.S. electorate and the market is saying we don't believe these statistics that we're seeing. We think prices are going to increase considerably, and I would put myself in agreement with some of these. Markets are also agreeing. If you look at yields on, this is the 30-year Treasury, but we could look at anything if you want, you can see that yields are going up a little bit. Now, we're not in stagflation zone yet from the 70s or 80s, but we're starting to knock on that door. And we also have a generation of Americans who don't remember inflation rates that high, who don't remember when a 10% interest rate might have been a good thing rather than a bad thing. So a generation of people who haven't figured that out. If you look at the CPI, if you look at inflation numbers right now, you can see the spike there that killed Joe Biden's reelection campaign in 2022. But the thing that I want you to focus on is what's going on in August 2025. We've definitely turned the corner in the wrong direction. Prices are creeping back upwards again, and this is something I've been saying since the beginning of the year. If you strip out the components of inflation, energy has been the only thing that is saving us right now. Energy prices are in the toilet, and they're in the toilet for other reasons. It's because the Saudis are trying to steal market share from other countries in the world, so they're pumping more oil than they know what to deal with. You've got this interesting thing happening where energy prices themselves are low, but everything else, whether it's labor, whether it's food, whether it's manufactured goods, whether it's commodities, all those things are up. And one of the things that we have happening right now is we have the Fed talking about cutting rates, even as inflation numbers, at least to my uneducated eyes, seem to be rising. And something there isn't working. All of which is to say, if you are going to deploy capital, if you're thinking about the future, do not expect that interest rates are going to go down considerably from here. Do not expect that we're just going to put inflation back in the genie bottle and everything is going to be fine. For the last 20, 30 years, we've gotten used to cheap capital, low interest rates, and inflation that was always going down and to the right. I think we're returning to an era of volatile inflation, where numbers will be up and down depending on what's happening in the economy, and where interest rates will be up and down depending on what's happening in the economy. So don't get trapped into this thinking that we're going to figure the situation out and things are going to go back to the way that they were in the early 2000s. I think it's more likely that they go back to the way that they were in the 1970s. So now is a good time to do things if you want to do things. Last but not least, before I do a little thought experiment and then turn it open to questions and hopefully disagreements. I think for U.S. agriculture, we have to stop thinking of food as a commodity, because it's not a commodity anymore for us if we're going to be successful, or at least if that small to medium-sized farmer is going to be successful. This is a chart that is showing you, this is for corn, we could do it for almost any crop, that is showing you how how competitive a US farm is versus some other farms in the world. So, and the conclusion of the chart is we're not competitive. We're not competitive with Argentina. We're not competitive with Brazil. We're not competitive with Canada. And we're not competitive with Ukraine, which is in the middle of a war with Russia. We are not the low-cost producer for a lot of the things that we were a low-cost producer for in the past. And one of the interesting things here also that I want to pair with is what's happening at home in our own country. Because as I talked about, U.S. ag has been focused on the world for 100 years, and for good reason. But some interesting things have been happening in the U.S. market. Number one, the share of disposable income that an American citizen spends on food has been going down really since World War I. I couldn't get the data going that far back, but I got it since 1964. And you can see we're spending less and less of our disposable income on food. We spend it on other things. You can also see, though, that per capita food spending has been rising. So even as our disposable income comes down, we're actually spending more on food in general. And one of the things I want to put in your mind, especially as we've gotten high egg prices, higher bread prices, all this talk about inflation and higher food prices, there is nothing in the Constitution that says American citizens are entitled to life, liberty, and cheap eggs. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington didn't think that. They were farmers themselves, after all. Yes, people will whine and complain and whinge about the fact that food is getting more expensive, and they will buy it. Because the last thing that any American family is going to do is not put food on the table. I think that that's something in terms of agriculture that we need to start thinking about. Less about can we make more of this and send it to global markets, and can we make better of this and charge a higher price so that we can get it into American households that want to be healthier in general. Again, just look and follow the data. Our exports of bulk food commodities, so your row crops and things like that, relatively flat going back to the early 2000s. Look at our export of high-value commodities. It's up and to the right. That's what people want. And when you look at the foods that Americans are importing, remember I talked about how we're importing more than we're exporting? We're not importing corns and corns. We're not importing corn and soybeans and other things like that. We have plenty of that here. What we're importing is higher value commodities that we either can't make in the United States, like your bananas or coffee or things like that, or fruits and nuts and vegetables and some of these other things that the economy is really hungry for that we're not satisfying with here in the United States in general. Millennials and Gen Z are at the forefront of this. This is a poll from McKinsey, and it's showing you that relative to boomers and Gen X, millennials and Gen Z spend a lot more of their disposable income on their own health, and in particular, on healthier food. And as a geriatric millennial who's wearing an Oura ring and is constantly obsessed with his health, I can tell you this rings true to me. Yes, we'll complain about eggs. We will still buy the fancy $10 sourdough bread thing that's on sale at the local farmer's market because it's that much better, because we've been convinced that that is a way to consume in a way that is better for our health and wellness. If you don't believe me there, just look at the rise of non-alcoholic beer. In the 2010s, 2015s, Athletic Brewing Company, for example, could not get any of the major beverage companies to even look at them or invest in them, using agricultural products that were probably getting left on the ground floor or not being used for much more. We're now getting non-alcoholic beer is going to account for roughly 6% of global beer sales last year, and that number is going up. We're talking about an industry that is going to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. People are buying Coca-Cola soda. They'll be buying it till the end of time. But that's not where Coca-Cola is seeing increases in its revenue. It has this deal with Fairlife, this dairy product that is double the protein and half the sugar, and they can't keep enough of it on the shelves. And Coca-Cola's been doing great. David protein bars, when they announced that they were going to start selling their protein bars, they were making $1 million a week in terms of revenue because of all the pent-up demand they were able to generate on Instagram and with their cooperation with some of these longevity gurus that seem to be proliferating all over the place. All of which is to say Americans are willing to spend more money on food, and they're willing to spend more money on things that they think are going to help their health in general. If we're thinking about the best future export market for the United States, may I submit to you that the best export market that we need to open is the United States. The average food insecurity rate in our country is 10.4%. We're the most agriculturally blessed, fertile country in the entire world, and our food insecurity rate is 10.4%. Where I live in Louisiana, we do this incredible trick where we're actually above that 10.4% national average, and we also have 50% obesity rates. And that's true in most of those southern states in general. So one of the things I want you to think about, I'm not saying that we should turn our backs on global markets, but we have turned our backs on domestic markets. And I think there are opportunities in US domestic markets that are hiding in plain sight. Okay, a thought experiment, and then would love to take your questions, comments, and anything else. One of the things that people ask me most often right now is, Jacob, how do you stay sane? The world seems like it's completely falling apart. Your job must suck because you have to study it and know about it all the time. And I say, look, these psychologists in 2023, they put out a paper in Nature magazine, and they had this incredible data set from 1949 to 2019, where they were asking the average American, is morality declining? Do you trust your neighbor? Is the world getting worse? Do you trust the next generation? And 84% of the time, from 1949 to 2019, Americans were saying, morality is getting worse, I don't trust my neighbor, the next generation sucks, and I'm locking my door more at night. They zoomed out a little bit, and for the countries that are in red here, they didn't have that same huge data set from 49 to 2019, but they had data from 1996 to 2007, and they asked relatively the same questions. I regard this, by the way, as the apex of human civilization, based on the music that came out during that time period. And even from 1996 to 2007, in every single country in red, you had people saying, morality is declining, the world is getting worse, I don't trust my neighbor as I'm locking my door more at night. Now, these psychologists explain this in two ways. The first is we love negative news. It is like junk food. It's like Culver's for our brain. We eat it. We want more of it. When you're driving along the road and there's an accident, you're telling yourself, I'm not going to slow down. I'm not going to slow down. Of course, you're going to slow down and look at the accident. And traffic's going to be backed up for an hour as a result of it. They've done studies that show that people click on and linger on negative news stories significantly longer than they do on positive news stories, which is why the news and media and social media is feeding you the negative crap, because that's how they make money, off of the clicks, and that's what gives them the clicks. The other interesting thing that these psychologists found, though, is something they called the nostalgia effect, which is you forget about the bad stuff 20, 25 years in the future. It's always the present that is bad. The present is the worst. The past was always better, even if you were miserable in that past and thinking about how the world was declining. So if they're right about this, I hope I'm lucky enough to be here with you in 2040, and we might just be saying to ourselves, don't you miss 2025? Don't you miss how civil our discourse, how stable foreign markets were at the time? Man, 2040 really doesn't work for us going forward. So here's the thought experiment. This is a picture of Wall Street in 1896. I want you to sit with the picture for a moment and imagine what it's like to be there. Maybe it's summer in New York City, there's no cars, there's horses and buggies, so any of you who have been in New York in the summer might imagine what that smells like. There's no electric light, so imagine how dark that street could be, or maybe you can smell kerosene or something like that that's burning light there in general. The clothing's very stiff, so maybe a whiff of starch, something like that. Try to sit with New York City in 1896 for a second. And then watch what happens to Times Square by 1911, 15 years later. The thing about multipolar geopolitical eras is that they are times of incredible change and incredible competition, but also incredible innovation and incredible growth and incredible opportunity. So I would submit to you, as I submitted to ChatGPT, imagine what your circumstance is going to be like in 2040. This is what ChatGPT gave me for Milwaukee in 2040. I don't know if that particularly rings true. But my parting message to you is I've talked to you about a lot of change and a lot of volatility and a lot of disruption. And I know that all of us are being fed negativity and volatility and uncertainty and risk, all these things all the time. And yes, there's a lot of change and there's a lot of disruption happening, but there's also a lot of opportunity. And I think the folks that are going to be successful over the next 15 years are the ones who get out of the fetal position, waiting for the past to come back, and instead recognize that we're in a new present, in a fundamentally new reality, and start making decisions and investments to capture those opportunities rather than expecting that the past is going to come back and everything is going to be okay. So with that, happy to engage with all of you on anything you want to talk about.